This episode, I'm joined once again by Paul Bishop to discuss Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for all their support, and if you'd like to support the podcast going into the new year, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, and please enjoy. So, Paul Bishop, thanks once again for joining me on the Hermitix podcast, and Merry Christmas. It's Christmas Day.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, James. Very glad to be here. And I'm going to keep it neutral and say season's greetings.
We're going to be discussing Thus Spoke Zarathustra by one Friedrich Nietzsche, which somehow we haven't got round to discussing.
I think it's a very good choice of a book, if I may say so, James. I think one could almost say that Thus Spake Zarathustra is the antidote to Christmas. So well chosen.
I think so, yeah. So I always like to go through the texts before selecting the questions. If I'm interviewing someone and they'll say, I've written this book, I'll read through the book, get some questions. So I thought, well, of course, I'll reread Thus Spake Zarathustra, which I hadn't really sat down properly with for, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those books that you occasionally will pick up and read a section, but I hadn't read it straight through for quite a while. And immediately I sort of forgot, much like Lectio Divina, just every sentence. I thought, well, I'm 5 pages in and I've got 20 questions for Paul. This is a book that is a book of a lifetime. If it's one of those books that if you said, give me a list of books desert island books that you can study, and every single sentence is just a wealth of symbolism and detail and depth. This is one. And so it's a difficulty to pry out of it questions that one at the same time will give a picture of it, but also seem relevant because it's doing 1,000 things at once. It's a real, I'm reading it, this Wagnerian theatrics and rhythm and musicality. It's overwhelming that this book came from a human being, to be quite honest.
Yeah, no, I think you've well summarised the appeal of this work, and perhaps also the challenge as well, because there is this density of meaning, and perhaps the work suffers a bit from the fact that everybody has at least heard of Thus Spake Zarathustra, but then when they actually sit down to read it, we realize why it's given the subtitle "A Book for All and None," and I think that this expectation that it will be appreciated by very few people that weighs heavily on one's mind, where one thinks, have I really got this right now, or am I missing something there? The book is kind of selecting its audience out in that way, and that's very different, I think, from the way that a lot of philosophical works operate. It's either a treatise and it's structured as such, or in the case of Plato, then it's a dialogue, and you'll have a polyphony of voices, but a whole series of discourses which are proclaimed by a Persian prophet, and this is meant to be what Nietzsche thinks is going to do the real thing at the end of the 19th century. That's what's so amazing about this remarkably ambitious book.
Remarkably ambitious being an understatement, because as you're describing the plot there of Zarathustra descending the mountain, you start thinking, well, the plot is that, but there's also this other thing going on, and another thing, and another thing. So there's always about 5 different layers going on at once, and I think it probably should be said that in this conversation we're going to touch at most 1% of what in the world is going on. I mean, immediately, so you're thrown in with symbols of an eagle and a mountain and a down going, and you say, right, well, I'm already kind of stuck here. But
that's absolutely right. But just to say, I think you've highlighted something very, very important there, which is that there is, in some sense, a story, a narrative. It is a series of discourses, but I think you've introduced something which might help people get into it, which is there is a storyline that basically of Zarathustra's ascent and descent and ascent and descent. So there is a kind of very, very basic but profound motion which is structuring the work as a whole.
Mm. Do you think that's one of the, because out of Nietzsche's entire corpus, this has sort of been pride. No, I don't want to, maybe not pried out with a crowbar, but it stands out as if, it's in these book lists of 50 books to read before you die, or I don't know, books for maybe even self-improvement, but it's in these great book lists. But I think for anyone who's, and I don't mean to be a gatekeeper or elitist, but for anyone who's read Nietzsche's other works, let's say his more philosophical works or his corpus, you say, well, that's great, but it has sort of been detached from the whole. And do you think this is because it is, in part a novel? It is a work of fiction.
I think that's true. I think one could say that it's another communication strategy that Nietzsche is trying out, if you like. So we get the academic treatise of The Birth of Tragedy, daringly without footnotes, and that brings the wrath of the classicists down upon him. You have the sequences of aphorisms, beginning with human or too human, and the aphoristic work is perhaps some of the places where we find Nietzsche at his wittiest and pithiest. You have the essay form in the Untimely Meditations. You have autobiography at the end, autobiography of kind, at any rate, with Ecce Homo. Treatises, those are the forms of On the Genealogy of Morals. That's a kind of sequence of three treatises, one could say. And then this work, which is so very, very different, as you say, a fictional character, and yet one that's rooted in history, because Zarathustra is Zoroaster, the ancient Persian poet. So it's both fictional and yet rooted in something very, very primordial, one could say, primordially historic.
Did Nietzsche write anything else fictional? Any other stories or attempts at fiction?
He writes poetry. There are poetic texts which he adds into The Gay Science, which is the work of 1882, immediately preceding his beginning work on Zarathustra. There are poems in a couple of other places right at the end of his creative time, the Dionysus dithyrambs. But I think this is the only case where we'd have something which is, you said a novel. I mean, I don't want to quarrel about genre, but in many ways, it's hard to say exactly what genre it is. Is it a poem? Is it a drama in many ways? Because of these speeches that are given. At the end of the day, I think one takes refuge in the expression of it being sui generis. There really is nothing quite like it, and that's one of the incredible achievements that Nietzsche has in this work.
We mentioned all those genres and all the different genres of fictional form there, but actually one we missed is it also reads like scripture.
Absolutely right. I mean, it is a parody of scripture, a parody in particular of the Lutheran translation of the Bible, and yet in many ways it has just as much influence on the development of German as a language as Luther did then. In a curious way, whilst being anti-Lutheran, anti-Christian, it recapitulates the work of those of Luther's translation of the Bible, fundamentally in changing the way that the German language is used. And I think that that's true of Nietzsche's writing as a whole. That it's a step change in the way that German is used. One only has to compare, for example, Schopenhauer. Much as I personally admire Schopenhauer, you've got quite long, complicated sentences. It's very learned. Sometimes he likes long paragraphs. That makes it a little bit hard to follow as well. But it feels very, very 19th century. On the other hand, by contrast, Nietzsche speeds up German. It becomes pithy, it becomes witty, it becomes punchy, it comes to the point. And in that sense, it's very modern. And in that sense, it's curious that it's, of all his works, the one which has, in a sense, aged the least of all. Ultimate Atlas, because one would say it is timeless.
As a Germanist, does it feel, is this style distinctly picked up, or does this feel almost not German?
It's it's part of that. It's steeped in parodic quotations from the Bible, from Goethe, from strange little idiosyncratic details that are woven into the text, and which I think remain as puzzles in some ways. And I'd recommend to anybody who has German. There is this incredible resource. There's a publishing project coming out of the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences, the Nietzsche Kommentar, and there is a 2-volume commentary on Spake Zarathustra. Each volume is about 1,000 pages. For a book which, as a Reclam edition, is small enough to fit into your pocket, small enough to fit into the knapsack of soldiers in the First World War, it should be said as well. And I think that just shows the incredible the amount of detail that's there, requiring a hermeneutic response. And I think it's excellent. It's also downloadable for free, which is amazingly generous of the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences, and it addresses some of these stylistic questions as well as, if you like, the conceptual ones as well. Absolutely fabulous. But it just shows, as you said, what a kind of task it is that what one's up against, and yet the book, I would say, does have this pull. It lures you in. Once it's got you, I think you'd say it never really lets you go.
Absolutely. Jumping a little bit back to scripture, just have a little play on scripture, because as many will understand, scripture is divinely inspired. So to jump to the origin of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and probably to be, maybe for some scholars, romantic. Maybe this has been, I don't know how you would disprove it, but to be romantic, it seems that when you look up the origin, as in where this book came from for Nietzsche, the origins are elusive. It's much like Socrates' daemon. This has, if we can say that the biblical scripture is divinely inspired, maybe we can say this is anti-divinely inspired. That, I think, for Nietzsche, so this was written, the dates are between about 2 years or 3 years, but really it was written, I think Nietzsche says, over 1 year, but each part was a sort of a real energetic 10 days, I think he says, per each part, where it just flowed out of him. So it seems that there's allusions here to something else might be speaking through him to create this text.
Well, in many ways, that's the $6 million question, isn't it? As to is it Nietzsche speaking, or is it something that's speaking through him in this work? I think it's significant that when he's discussing it, the genesis of the work, which he describes as the greatest gift that he's ever given to mankind, when he's discussing its genesis in Ecce Homo, he talks very precisely, as you have done, about it being scripture, as about it being, he says, inspiration. And he says, has anybody else had this experience of inspiration, which I have had? So he does put it very much into that category of something that's been revealed. I think there can be all sorts of psychological theories about how it came to be, but I think it's tied up with something that happened in Sils Maria in August 1881, which Nietzsche calls the intuition of eternal recurrence. And there he is, and if you've been to Sils Maria, you can wander around the lake where this intuition, vision, revelation, accordingly well, is said to have taken place. And of course, this raises this whole question about is there something experiential which is coming to the surface in this work? Is there something confessional, or is this also Nietzsche, as he so often does, playing a game? Inserting himself into a tradition with a kind of knowing wink to those of his readers who are going to appreciate it. He talks about it in a letter of December 1882 in relation to the idea of him becoming pregnant with this text. And I think that speaks to this idea of the revelation coming from within, but also, of course, echoes there of Plato, of Socrates as the philosophical midwife, and this idea that one can give birth to oneself. So it's both something profoundly experiential, but it's also related to the deepest form of the Western tradition, namely the Platonic or Socratic.
Were you inspired when you were there? Did you feel inspiration?
Yes and no. I think the problem with it is you go with all the kind of baggage of having tried to understand the text. I think the problem is that you think, oh well, if I could only go to the place where this was written, then I would understand it. It's certainly very beautiful. I mean, I'd recommend anybody who wants to go there. I mean, Switzerland isn't the cheapest of holiday destinations, but it's well worth going there and visiting the Nietzsche house, this tiny little house where Nietzsche rented a room for the summers when he wrote the text. So between 1882 and 1884. But again, I think it's interesting that the poem that Nietzsche writes about the composition of Zarathustra, which is called Sils Maria, and he adds that into the songs of Prince Vogelfrei, the songs of Prince Friersebird, which is added to the Gay Science when it is put into its second edition. But the original version of that of that poem was not called Sils Maria. It was about Rapallo in Italy. And when Nietzsche first starts writing Zarathustra, he's already moved back to the Ligurian coast in Italy. So the story that we're told is not exactly true, and yet the story that we're told about, by virtue of him writing this very, very famous little poem, Sils Maria. In the Kaufmann translation, it says, "Here sat I waiting, not for anything, beyond good and evil, fancying, now light, now shadows, all a game, all lake, all noon, all time without all aim. Then suddenly, friend, one turned into two, and Zarathustra worked into my view." And I think the idea is there's a poetic truth to this. There's something happens, and it's out of this experience that Nietzsche is able to bring both his conscious powers as a writer to this unconscious intuition, or this primordial experience that he has of the eternal recurrence, which is one of the main organizing ideas in Zarathustra. And again, having this sense of the key organizing ideas gives one some kind of a purchase on this puzzling and enigmatic work.
So Zarathustra, in relation to the eternal recurrence, which I think many scholars seem to agree is if there is a central, and that's probably a bit of a lazy word, but a central thread, recurrent thread, that is the one. Do you see that as Nietzsche attempting to, in that moment of being inspired by internal recurrence, seeking to come up with an answer as to how to deal with what if it isn't dealt with, could be seen as an abject horror?
Yeah, well, I was trying to describe the importance of understanding Nietzsche's turn to a poetic form, to a dramatic form, a lyrical form, as part of a new communication strategy. And I think this communicative strategy is part of the theme that Zarathustra, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, when he comes down from the mountain, goes off to the marketplace to make the great teaching about the Übermensch, the Superman. Nobody in the marketplace listens to him. In fact, they laugh at him. It's a huge communication flop. And I think that one of the things that Nietzsche is exploring is the problem of announcing something, which is inspirational, which is, if you like, a new gospel. Part of his ongoing reflection on how do we deal with the idea of the gospel, the idea of revelation, and whether we can ever get it to make any sense for us. And so he builds this into the plot of Zarathustra, that the big announcement of the Übermensch falls flat. He has difficulty finding disciples. There's this sense of the disciples don't really understand what he's on about. That, again, a very clear scriptural echo from the New Testament as well. And then when he does have, when he thinks about the eternal recurrence and tries to announce it, the words that he uses are turned into a song by the animals in the cave where he's living, and they turn it into a kind of hurdy-gurdy song. So I think you have both the pronouncement, the announcement of the doctrine of recurrence, and at the same time, you have this sense of, well, how could anybody do that? How could you get that point across to somebody? Because it is such an awful idea.
He does that. Nietzsche seems to do that a lot. He seems to quickly usurp his own point, as if to constantly keep us on our toes. He does this especially in Zarathustra, with when he takes up, and it's sort of transparent how he takes up these Christian ethical practices, but he very quickly doesn't. It's not the antithesis of the ethical practice, but it's something in between. He's always doing this. He's always playing with expectations, and I think it's a book, that I think probably the biggest misconception, and I would argue abuse of this book, is in not continuing to read a sentence, metaphorically speaking. So he quickly sort of says, oh, you should do this, but then he's also quick to usurp his own point as to, to open this sort of liberatory philosophy in relation to the eternal return. And yet the book has been consistently sort of used as abused as a manual of sorts. So we need to accept Nietzsche's whole game, I think.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think you foreground there something which is very important, which is this ludic dimension, the playfulness. It's not something for which Nietzsche is commonly best known as having a sense of humor, but it seems to be quite clear that there is the sense of humor all the way throughout Zarathustra, not least because there are potential parodies of his personal circumstances. I mean, the whole history of the failed affair with Lou van Salome, for example. You can see certain parts of his oeuvre as almost in a self-mocking way, referring to that. Remember, you have in Zarathustra all these feminine figures that are there. Life is described as a woman. You have the famous line about going to women and taking the whip, which is not voiced by Nietzsche, not even directly by Zarathustra, but by the little woman that he beats in one of the chapters in part one. So you've got distance, you've got play, you've got, I think you're absolutely right, this refusal to turn it into a kind of a clear self-help manual with, these are the steps. He's not a Jordan Peterson, okay? I mean, Nietzsche's not telling us to get our bedroom into tidy and into order and so on. And he might be wrestling with God in the same way that Peterson claims to be at the moment, but that's maybe a discussion for another occasion. But one of the most striking lines, I think, in Zarathustra is the proposition, the way does not exist. And so if you are saying to people, you are going to have to be engaging on a path towards authenticity, you can't tell people what that authenticity is going to be like. That is the central paradox. And if we ask ourselves, well, why is Nietzsche so playful, and why is he pulling the rug from under himself and so on, I think is as part of this refusal to make things easy for us, that this is a set of doctrinal principles that we would sign up for. And that's what makes it so difficult, I think, for his disciples are shown as not understanding this, because ultimately you go beyond being a disciple if you're going to become a master of yourself. And I think that's this paradoxical idea of encouraging people to be authentic. How do you put that transfer of power? How do you give that back to people? And I think that's something which is part of this theme of a communication strategy that doesn't work. How do you tell people, in a way, not to listen to you?
To learn, and then I mean, this reminds me just very briefly of the gospel. the Gnostic gospel of. We'll go to Jung in a bit, but the Gnostic gospel of Judas, where the point is, well, Judas knew that he had to betray Christ, and in doing so, sort of goes one further, if you like, as you were saying. How do you teach authenticity, which allows itself to go beyond that teaching itself? But that makes me wonder, before we get to Zarathustra's ages, because they're this age of 30 to 40 is a very intriguing age, especially for Jung as well. Where is Zarathustra, the character? Who is his teacher?
Well, he's a prophet, so he has the authority that comes with the prophet, but he's a prophet in a godless world. And remember, this theme that we've talked about on earlier occasions about the death of God is something which is taken for granted in Zarathustra. There's a reference back to very early on in the prologue when Zarathustra comes across the old man in the forest, a hermit-like figure singing his songs and psalms, and then when they leave, there's this sort of turning to the audience, as it were, on Zarathustra's part, and he says, "Well, how amazing!" He says, "This old man in the forest, he hasn't heard that God is dead." So that is taken as a starting point, and therefore it's another example of that paradoxical, playful nature. We have a prophet, but we don't have a God behind him, and in fact, we have the absence of a God behind him. And there's a moment in Ecce Homo where Nietzsche says, "It's curious that nobody's asked me what the name Zarathustra means," and so on. And he says, the historical Zoroaster invents good and evil, and that's why my Zoroaster, Zarathustra, has to come and take us beyond good and evil. In other words, to take us away from this dualistic, as Nietzsche would see it, this dualism which is tied up with Western morality, Christian, Judeo-Christian morality, all moralities of any kind, I think, because we've got this figure of Zoroaster who's involved with it, and what makes it difficult for Zarathustra to do his job is that he is a prophet in a godless universe, and people don't want to hear that.
It's interesting as well. In our last discussing your book about your Christian reactions to the death of God, it's intriguing as well with this basically Christian hermit, who I absolutely adore. This scene, it's one of the sort of more wholesome scenes right at the beginning, but it's also a nod to, we mentioned how Erich Shavara says that this can only come from a Christian soul. I think this is Nietzsche's moment of nodding to the fact, look, I'm not saying that was never a thing, but it is gone, and that scene really does solidify. Yeah, you can try, but the acknowledgement of this older life, Ludwig Klages would say, he's a consciousness out of time. We're looking at an older consciousness, and you can't suddenly just become an older consciousness. So it's a sort of it's oddly wholesome and fond farewell in an otherwise quite emotionally chthonic and uproarious book.
I think that's a very good way to put it. And there's this a delightful little detail when the two men part, is they were told, "Thus they parted from each other, the old man and the younger, laughing just like two boys laughing." So there's this kind of sniggering with which they both take leave from each other. And again, I'd love to know what that is actually meant to mean. How do we how do we decode that? But it's clearly a contrast to this very simple acknowledgement which comes in the next line. Oh, and by the way, God's dead. So that's that kind of stylistic sophistication, a sense of humor, as well as the deep seriousness that's there as well. And I think you're right to talk about the kind of the great span of this book, of delightful little bits of detail, some wonderfully lyric passages like the Night Song, that sequence of songs that we find in part 2 that Shavara quotes in great detail and compares with other Christian writings. There is something profoundly Christian about this book because it's anti-Christian. And I think that's the central paradox that we've been teasing out in our discussions with Nietzsche, that it's precisely in his opposition to Christianity that Nietzsche reveals himself to be deeply rooted within that tradition.
And you're speaking of the span of the novel. I mean, it begins ultimately with a 10-year span of Zarathustra at 30, then going up the mountain for 10 years and descending back at 40. But it's this age of 30, which, if I'm remembering right, is extremely important for Jung, Rudolf Steiner, I believe, said I think about 28, 30 is the next. He had 7-year phases, I think. But 30 is throughout. It's this strange year of growth, year of the true, some real self developing. Why do you think? Because for Nietzsche, this is an oddly specific, it's a very specific thing to add in dates and ages. Why do you think? Yeah, why do you think this is?
Yeah, no, that's right. Clearly, it's of importance because it's there right in this first little narrative paragraph, which sets up the entire story. Steiner has lots of different ways, and the Steinerian tradition have different ways of dividing up the periods of the human life, just as there are different ways of dividing up the epochs. 7 is a kind of favorite number there for these kinds of schemes. But I think you're right to foreground Jung's idea about the midlife crisis, that kind of difficult period, which typically would be around 40 and so on. And what makes this such a Nietzschean idea, I think, in the case of Jung, is that his essay, The Stages of Life, where he sets out this idea, is full of imagery of solar rising and setting. And that is also one of the great imagistic structural devices that we find in Zarathustra, because here in this very first section of the prologue, we see that Zarathustra, after he's left his home, gone into the mountain, where he enjoys his spirit and his solitude and doesn't get tired of it. Okay? But then something changes. There's this moment of transformation. His heart changes, and he goes out and addresses the sun and says, how lucky you are to have people that you can shine upon. So you have a real Copernican moment here, that it's not the sun that's the system, but it is the human being. And yet it's not simply the human being, it's going to be the human being that's going to come. And that, of course, is I think how we are to understand the idea of the superhuman being, the human being that goes over the overman, the superman, the Übermensch. And although I don't like using German phrases like that, Übermensch is such an easy way of talking about it because it captures that idea of transition, of going over, of transformation in the way that the English equivalents, they simply don't do it and are misleading and have other connotations and so on. And it's at that point when he talks, well, I'm not the only one who's been going up mountains and so on. He says, for these last 10 years, you've been coming up in this mountain every morning. As part of the cycle of the sun, and you would have got bored with this had it not been for me being here. And then you've mentioned these symbols as well, my snake and my eagle. So we have there this reconstellation of the universe. That what matters is to be it's a profoundly humanistic kind of gesture, profoundly superhumanistic kind of gesture, because this transformation that his heart undergoes is going to become the transformation that he wants of humankind as a species. Human beings as a group are to think themselves out of this decadent moment in which they find themselves, this nihilistic moment of the death of God, and they are to transform that death, which is a loss, into something new which is going to be born and take its place, and that is this mysterious Übermensch, which is left there as a powerful idea related to eternal recurrence, the thought of which is meant to be the mechanism for testing just how life-affirming one is, and therefore how far one is on the way to becoming this supra-human being, this Übermensch.
There's also, I mean, we spoke of him playing games. I think there's also, I mean, I really dislike Plato's allegory of the cave. So this notion with the sun, it makes it with the fact that he's clearly also in the Platonic, or in discussion, in dialogue with the Platonic tradition here, it seems that he's inverting that exit from the cave and saying, well, actually, the sun's light isn't the truth. I was the truth all along. But still goes into the cave and gets basically, almost, killed, as in Plato's tradition. So this the little game there. He's always
Just to pick up on that point, I think you're right that the cave allegory is being echoed and explicitly being played around with here, because this moment of transformation doesn't take place inside the earth, but rather up on the mountains. So the cave is taken away from being down there and moved up there. Some of the language that he uses to talk about the superfluity, the flowing over of the sun and so on, again echoes ideas that we find in the Republic about the overflow from the treasury of the sun as being like a giant eye, says Socrates. Your calm eye is what Zarathustra says about the sun. So it's very rich and very elusive of the Platonic tradition, which it is seeking to invert, and the Christian one as well, because it's around the age of 30 that Christ goes into the desert. Christ goes into the desert for 40 days. So Zarathustra has to go one better. He's going to go up at a mountain, and he's going to go there for 10 years. But I think you have this idea of a moment of caesura, a moment of turning around, where the individual assumes upon themselves the responsibilities that they have. That's the function, I think, of the cave allegory, isn't it? That we're to understand that we are to find our way out of the cave. It's there in the gospel story of Christ going through the three temptations, affirming what his mission on earth is going to be, what his salvific program is going to consist of. And that feeds then into, well, Zarathustra will have this similar moment as well, only what we're given is a failure to understand. In that sense, not entirely unlike the New Testament, because it's one of the great themes, isn't it, in the Gospels about why does Jesus talk in parables? Because, as he says, that they may see, that they may look but not see, that they may hear but not understand. And this problem of communication, I think, is central to the Gospels, just as it is to Zarathustra.
So, with those sort of maybe two or three things, with Plato, we see once again the verticality, rising upwards and outwards towards the sun. Once again, this sort of high up, metaphor, symbolically transcendent, greater intelligence coming down from the sun, if you want to put it that way, very roughly. Same with Christianity, with the logos. Same with the notion of, having a head. Quite literally, there's this top-down verticality. And so the reason I mentioned that I don't like Plato's allegory of the cave is because I think the great assumption that Plato makes that really does annoy me is that it would be day when you leave the cave. I mean, I want to rewrite the cave, but it's nighttime and they don't know what to do and they bump into things, which seems to me more like the real experience of being human. But the reason I say that, and I don't mean to be too coy, because Nietzsche has this emphasis on night, on darkness, but also on being headless. So there, even though he's playing around with these symbols of the sun, of going up the mountain, there is this move away from that hierarchical verticality towards something like, draw him in, the irrationalism, and I use that word very carefully, of Klages. Not irrational in the sense that people condemn him for, but irrational in that playful, creative, Dionysian sense. Headless, sunless, in the dark, and yet still creative.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful to put in people like Jung, like Klages, because they have clearly got so much out of Nietzsche, and by looking at what they have found of use, I think they can help us lesser mortals kind of reorganize and track more accurately what the significance of Nietzsche really is. And I think you're right to say that there is. Whilst it's misleading to talk about a simple irrationalism in Klages, there is nevertheless a sense that we're meant to be seeing reason in its place, and seeing it as not the be all and end all, because behind the reason, as Zarathustra puts it, there is this deeper self. There is the body, and this emphasis on physicality, on the incarnated, if one wanted to use the theological term, the incarnated nature of human life, that we are not simply proto-noetic individuals, but we are very much embodied physically and psychologically and historically. And I think that that's something where there is an important connection between what Klages sees as his task to be equally as radical as Nietzsche's, just as Nietzsche is turning upside down the entire Western tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly, I think, in its Enlightenment articulation. And so Kant is one of the big bugbears there, Hegel as well. In a way, Klages is just kind of trying to do that, but go one better, because the entire tradition is going to be inverted by him, because it's in Geist itself, it's in intellect itself, intellect understood primarily in its expression as will. That's where it all goes wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's an interesting constellation here between the function of the will in Klages, which is almost entirely problematic, as opposed to the will in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which is this will to power. A will to power ultimately over oneself, because it's oneself that one's ultimately seeking to transform and to change. And there's this line which Jung picks up on in his seminar, where Zarathustra says, your will and your feet which seek to surpass you, let these be your new honor. So there is this sense that what the level of engagement that's required is more than simply intellectual assent. It's something which has to move us entirely, and that includes the body. And that's something which Jung, I think, also emphasizes, is this new emphasis on the body that we owe to Nietzsche.
And with respect to Nietzsche, this inversion that we're talking about, to frame Zarathustra just as a full inversion would be incorrect. It's not some sort of fully chaotic, anarchic novel. And this, when I was reading through, especially when Zarathustra begins to sort of list ethical practices, that for me is, I don't know if you feel this betrays the book, but I think it's the one place where certain aspects of Nietzsche's own loves, especially Prussian discipline, comes through. And there's this element of this overman, possible sort of creativity of the self, over the self, more than the self, from a sort of headlessness, possibly. There's still this tinge of Prussian military discipline, which so many philosophers had a deep love for, and he just the way it's written, these disciplines, he just doesn't seem to quite be able to escape it.
Well, I think that's a very intriguing point. It's sort of, you can take the boy out of Naumburg and out of Schulpforte, but you can't take Naumburg and Schulpforte out of the boy. I guess it's true of every writer that they will, to some extent, bear that inheritance of the educational process from which they've emerged. But I think one wouldn't want to, whilst acknowledging that, I don't think one should shy away from saying, as what is the big moment of beating drums and thunderous rhetorical effects, a bit like that great epiphanic moment at the beginning of Richard Strauss's tone poem, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which everybody will know from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Well, just after that great epiphanic beginning, one then moves into much more lyrical, much more dance-like sequences in the Strauss tone poem, and that is entirely true, I think, and faithful to the text of Zarathustra as a whole. And I think one of the most moving chapters is the one called "The Stillest Hour," which is at the end of part 2, when he hears, and another paradoxical idea, this silent voice that's speaking to him, and the voice says, "The dew falls upon the grass when the night is at its most silent. Something said to me as in a whisper. It is the stillest words which bring the storm. Thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world." And I think there that I find a beauty which surpasses that kind of Prussian restriction that's been there, we should also see Nietzsche as, in many ways, having overcome that background, overcome his own circumstances and failures, particularly with regard to the disastrous relationship with Paul Ray and Lou von Salome, and the work, as well as having these great epiphanic moments, also had these moments of great stillness and of great contemplative beauty as well.
So who do you feel, you mentioned this right at the beginning, and I now we've got a good amount of themes and discussion. Who do you feel the book is selecting for this new way of being? As you said, it Nietzsche mentions that the book selects its reader. Yeah. All or none?
Well, it's been interesting. I have to say, one of the most interesting experiences as working in higher education in the UK and in German studies has been attempting to teach this text, which is often described by some people as, oh, well, you can't teach that. That's going to be far too difficult for them, and so on. It certainly is a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge. Often, though, one sees that it's the most challenging texts that bring out the best in people. And I think that self-selecting part goes with all you can do when teaching Zarathustra, and all you can do when doing a podcast on Zarathustra, is to propose the work, to introduce it, to invite people, and then it's up to the listener or it's up to the student to take it further. And you can be a guide along the way, but ultimately it's going to have to be their own journey that they're going to make. And I think that one of the strange things about this comment about all and none and so on is that for work that's been very much misunderstood, in some cases only read quotationally rather than its entirety, which hasn't helped, it has had an immense influence. There's a famous remark made by the German expressionist poet Gottfried Benn, when he says, everything my generation discussed, thought through inwardly, one could say, suffered, one could even say, took to the point of exhaustion, all of it had already been said by Nietzsche. All the rest was just exegesis. And I think that is a way of saying, well, it's not quite everybody, but it wouldn't be fair to say that it's nobody. And it's left its legacy through the artists, the writers, the poets, the novelists, the philosophers who've come in touch with this and who've allowed it to influence their own work.
And this is 1886 is first published?
It appears in three separate parts in 1883. The fourth part, the final part, which is perhaps the most jokey and parodic, is privately published. So it's not until much later, I think it's about 1886, that it appears as a work on its own. And of course, that again is part of this strange history of the genesis and then interpretation of Nietzsche, is you have this lonely figure with no institutional backing once he's left Basel University, producing these works which have very, very few copies of them are made. And then about 10 years later, and coinciding with his death, is that all of a sudden an interest starts getting taken in him, and then from the end of the 19th into the early 20th century, all of a sudden Nietzsche becomes the rage. He's discovered by the expressionists in particular. Feminists find Nietzsche useful. Psychologists, Freud, Nietzsche is so important that for Freud that he has to pretend he hasn't read him, and so on. Nietzsche says in his account in Memories, Genes, Reflections, he says, I was afraid that I was a bit like Nietzsche myself. I was fascinated and also worried at the same time. And then, of course, from 1934 to 39, Jung gives us his magisterial interpretation of the text in his series of seminars. Doesn't quite get into the end because world events kick off and mean that he never gets beyond about halfway through part 3, I think.
I say that because, it's been getting on 130, 140 years, and it feels, even though it has an immense popularity, and I feel, as you mentioned the Ben quote there, we've certainly dealt with it as a text thoroughly, but it doesn't really feel that something has been written or formulated that has got that even a small group would point to say we've begun to move beyond, move forward with there is nothing yet that has really put Zarathustra behind it. I was thinking, I've been reading recently The Sacred Conspiracy on Bataille's Asafal movement, and it's really interesting, but I think to myself, well, if one of the main influences of the text in its clearest group influence is to all agree to ritually kill a man, I'm not sure we've made too much headway from Zarathustra. But do you feel, I mean, maybe, well, I was going to say Being in Time, but that's just a different beast altogether. I don't feel there's any other text that you could really put a flag in the ground and say, well, that's the next move we've made. Maybe I'm being too generous to Nietzsche.
Well, let me suggest one that might fall into that category, James.
Mm.
What about Jung's Red Book?
Maybe if we'd initially, but so there's a bit of a paradox there. I think if Jung had been understood fully from the get-go as more of a mystic and alchemist, then maybe. But because he had so much time where people were trying to avoid that, to not look at it, it's now we're dealing with this. There's sort of a split in the consciousness of how we understand Jung. I think of some people who would still say, oh, Jung the psychologist, and some would say Jung literally the mystic. So, that's another book. What do you do with it?
Yeah.
But I see what you mean.
I mean, I think that it's very hard to move past Zarathustra because of this paradoxical nature, the hermeneutic problems it throws up, and also because the Germans have a saying, "Gut Ding will Weile brauchen." Everything that's worthwhile, takes a long time, and so on. And it's a century, but what's that in terms of history of humankind and the history of the universe? That's really just a fraction of a second. And if we remember that passage in The Gay Science where the death of God is announced, that the madman says it's going to take generations for people to come to terms with what they're hearing, just as the light that we see in the stars takes centuries, millennia to reach us, so the news of the death of God is going to take millennia. And it's going to take a long, long time before we can come to terms with it as well. And I think that's something that, detractors as well as admirers of Nietzsche would agree on, is that it's going to take a long time fully to get to grips with Zarathustra. And that's what makes it exciting, is that it's both, as it were, on that bucket list of great texts. That's one reason for reading it, but also because, a bit like the Red Book, it has a power, and it takes time for that for one to come to terms with that as a reader. You've got to let the text work on you, as well as engaging with it directly. That requires that thing that we have least of all at the moment these days: time.
Do you feel, as a Nietzsche scholar, do you feel there's any key misinterpretations of Zarathustra, especially as it's not only his most popular, but also has, you'll be reading a book list and it'll say Moby Dick, Frankenstein, thus spoke Zarathustra, which is like a strange thing to see. Do you feel there's any misconceptions or misunderstandings of Zarathustra that you would like to see go away?
Well, I mean, there are some misunderstandings, one might say, are more productive. Some are less productive. I mean, it's certainly the case that a leading Germanist at a seminar which I was a member of as a postgraduate, thought that Zarathustra was a terrible book. He said it's awful. He says it's embarrassing. He said just don't waste your time with it. He said. And I think, that for me would fall into the category of, the worst advice that you could give a postgrad, because I simply don't believe it's true. But I think that's an example of the way that people have come up with strategies to try and pigeonhole at the work, to tame it, to make it safe. So to read it in purely psychological terms, I mean the most sort of reductive psychological terms. And I remember there was a wonderful comment that I got from a student when I was teaching just the first part of it for a course on the figure of the hero, and somebody put, I think it was when we were doing teaching by Zoom, and a student put a comment in the chat. Nietzsche's problem was he didn't have a girlfriend. And that was both reductive and at the same time very insightful. I mean, so it all depends what you do with that. Of course, that remark was made with that crucial, I'm sure, was made with that crucial Nietzschean ingredient of a sense of humor. So
why do you say that's insightful?
Well, because there is something to do with, because it was somebody trying to come to terms with this text, who maybe knew about this famous story of Nietzsche and Buffon, Salome, and so on. I mean, I don't want to put too much interpretive weight on a casual comment that somebody made in a Zoom chat. But what I liked about it was that it was trying to come to terms with the text. I mean, you could have just not made any comment at all. That's just not left it. I agree that if you were to take that as a hermeneutic principle for how you're going to understand Nietzsche, but people have done that. I mean, there is this idea. Again, we've talked about the whole problem is not so much Nietzsche and a girlfriend, but because he's mad. And I think that's another, and that one is still out there. This old canard about, well, look what happened to him, and we can dismiss everything that he writes. And I think I would always applaud people who, well, it's not so much being reductive, but to understand anything complex, you first of all have to simplify it in order to get into it. And I think that's just simply the way that our minds work. And there's another kind of reduction which is to choke off an understanding, and they can often be very, very close. But I think they're coming out of a different spirit. And I've always admired any student who stands up and tries to take a thesis and tries to put it forward and contribute something to one's understanding, rather than people who say, well, I'm just going to dismiss this because at the end of the this bloke that we're reading, he was a nutter.
I wonder, I think of that phrase, which has then been used for one of the more recent Nietzsche biographies, I am dynamite. I wonder if what we want to do is snip off the fuse or bring the dynamite in on a little pillow, and we study dynamite for years, and we all know that if you light it, it'll explode and be fantastic. But we're not really a culture that likes explosions anymore, and Zarathustra is an explosion. And maybe it's also, the explosion goes off, and with that girlfriend comment, it's the question of we want a reason. But why is it exploded? Yeah, because it's because it's dynamite. That's why.
Yeah. No, I know. I think that's right. And it's again, I'd say anyone who makes the effort of trying to come to terms with it, even if their initial apprehension, one might on further reflection say is not correct or not the full story, is that we always begin, the whole process of learning begins with misunderstanding. And we might say that that's built into Zarathustra as well, because he is so vastly misunderstood. And he realizes very quickly, he never goes into the marketplace a second time. Okay. He realizes that's not the way to do it. And he tries with the disciples, that doesn't quite work, and so on. And at the end, you don't have him defeated, even though it's all worked out terribly badly with these higher individuals, the Hurra mentioned, the higher men, the higher individuals. They've proved to be utterly useless as well. And yet the final page, the final chapter of Zarathustra takes us back to that final moment when he cries out, his countenance transformed into brass. He says, all of this has had its time. What do I aspire after happiness? I aspire after my work. This is my morning. My day begins. Rise up now, rise up, great noontide. And Zarathustra leaves his cave glowing and strong, like the morning sun emerging from behind dark mountains. So built into it is this idea: the real adventure has only just begun.
There we go. What a fantastic place to finish. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I'd just like to say that I think it is the real antidote to Chris, but the real antidote to many things as well. There are superb translations of it available. It's one of the most translated texts. I think the one by Graham Parks is very helpful. I think the one by Adrian Del Caro is very helpful as well. There's the Hollingdale in Penguin that we've mentioned. If you want something that's and out of date and out of copyright, there's the old Thomas Common translation floating around the internet as well.
Was that the first?
It was one of the first. I think there was, in fact, one slightly earlier than it by Alexander Tiller, who was a rather strange character in Glasgow, who produced it. So there was this great Scottish reception of Nietzsche before it began. But I think I'd say Hollingdale, Parks, Del Caro would be good places for people to start. And if you've got German, there's the Nietzsche Kommentar that you can download, and that would keep you going through Christmas Day, Boxing Day, and right through into the New Year as well.
Wow, there we go. There's all the recommendations, and I assume you're still working on your Faust and Jung text.
Faust and Jung text, that is going to be my present to the world. I'm looking to complete the manuscript on that right at the end of January.
Any other projects we should know about, or is that your?
What I'm focused on, I hope then to move on after Goethe's Faust to look at Nietzsche's Zarathustra from the Jungian framework, and as a way up to leading to the end of that sequence, on the idea of transformation, which will be the Red Book. So in that sense, I'm very much looking forward to the new year and all that it will bring.
There we go. Wow, Paul Bishop once again. Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, James.